Now let's take a look at how compositions works. Now, in order to do that, let's create an empty composition, and we can do this in build mode. We press Shift F, and we will see new composition spawned. We can rotate it as other objects with Shift and mouse wheel, and also we can change its size by holding Control and using the mouse wheel. And we can drag and drop it with the right and left mouse buttons, just as other objects. Now, this representation of size and for objects in the composition, it is absolutely not necessary to be inside this circle or inside this square. They can be very well outside. It's okay. And this representation is just for the user, for the better reference, better idea how big the composition is and how it is rotated, situated in the world. Excuse me. So basically, let's try and add some objects to this composition. There are several ways to do that, and the first of them is just basically create objects while the composition is being selected, and we do this simply by selecting certain object and clicking left mouse button with the control in order to place several objects in this composition. Now, as long as the composition is selected, all those objects will be automatically added to the composition. Let's see, objects can be as well outside of the composition. Okay. Now, if we select this composition, you see all those objects are highlighted. And if we select the individual objects, you can see they all belong to this composition. You can see this by blue line. It's also possible to select all of them. Now, when you drag the composition around, all objects that are inside this composition will move as well. And they all will be rotated around the center of the composition. But you can, of course, move the objects inside composition separately. And they will still be inside composition. Now, as I said, there are more ways to add objects to this composition, and we can also add existing objects to the composition, or basically change the ownership of the object. Let me show you how. Let's place some bricks, like here, and maybe there. Now, as you can see, those objects are not part of the composition. They are not being selected. And in order to actually add those objects to the composition, we need to select it, the composition, and then point the object we want to add and press R. Let's do this with all objects. As you can see, it is rendered as selected, so green icon. Now, those objects are now part of composition as well. We can rotate it and drag around. It is also possible to add all objects in composition radius to the composition with one single click. And let me show you how to do this. Let's add a little bit more of objects. And we do this by selecting the composition and then pressing the Shift R. Now as you see, all objects that were not in composition was added there. And those objects, of course, was outside of the composition, and thus they were not added. It is also possible to reset the ownership of objects, or in other words, make them not belong to the composition anymore. And we can do this by selecting several objects that we don't want to be inside compositions. Let's say those. Maybe those. Now, in order to reset their ownership, we press Alt-R. And as you can see, all those objects are now deleted from the composition. We can now drag the composition away. Those objects will not be affected. In many cases, it is quite simple to select the composition. But there are some cases when it isn't that simple. Let's make an example. First, let's make a house. Maybe like this one. Now let's place a composition. And let's place this composition inside house. Let's set it as a part of the composition by pressing R. Now as you can see, it is rather hard to select the composition itself because it's inside the building, and no matter how hard you try to point this out, it won't be possible. It's actually impossible to select the composition itself this way. But there is a way to do that. First of all, in option menu, which is accessible by pressing F1, let's make sure that the object selection range is rather big. 10 meters, for example, would be okay. Now, in order to select the composition itself and ignore any object that might get on the way, let's point our cursor somewhere on the ground where there's no objects. Then hold Ctrl and hit left mouse button. As you can see, the composition actually selected, not the object. Now, in order, we can also press right mouse button, and as you can see, not the composition grabbed, but the nearest object, which is also might not be what you actually want to. So let's press Escape to cancel the grabbing, and let's now select the composition again with the holding Control, and now we can hold Control again and press right mouse button. Now instead of selecting the closest object, we selected the closest pivot point, and now we can actually move this composition somewhere. It is also possible to select only the composition with the frame select. To do this, we have to hold Shift and Control simultaneously, and then draw a frame around the composition we want to select. And all objects will be ignored, and only the composition will be selected. Now we can hold Control and press right mouse button in order to pick whatever we have selected.